At this late stage in the project, I wasn't really sure what direction this video was going to take. I just know that there's jobs all over the car. But I started into the back bumper, and then it started to make sense to keep doing things around the back end of the car. This was the area of the car that I found the most stubborn bulls. I guess it's all exposed to the spray from the rear wheels of the car. I sprayed everything with Q10 penetrating oil beforehand, and then actually eased some of them back in again using Q20 lubricant, and got most of them off without too much trouble. Some, like these holding on the rear fog light, were a lost cause, so I cut them off and then drilled them out. The brackets actually holding on that fog light were the only bit I couldn't save. They were too far rusted, so I was going to have to make replacements of those. There were nice little clips holding on this little wiring harness, so I'd try and replicate the mountings for these in the parts that I'd fabricate. So lots of lubricant and lots of cleaning out the threads, and I was able to disassemble all these metal parts of the rear bumper. I cut off and drilled out the remaining bits of the bolt that went into the back of the fog light. I had to be really careful on this bracket because I wanted to preserve one of them in its entirety, so that I had a datum point for the position of the fog light. So I cut the bolts, pulled out the remaining pieces, and I did get it out in one part, because the rest of the bumper bracket would clean up and was still substantial enough to do its job. I copied the part onto some steel. It's a little bit lighter than the original, but it's going to be better than holding the fog light on with a bunch of cable ties or something like that. And it's more substantial than what's been there probably for the last 10 years of the car's history. The second bracket I needed was pretty much the same, but just a little bit longer. I prepared the fixing point for that too. It needed drilling out. The whole thing slipped just at the last minute, but when it hit the floor it knocked out the piece that I needed. The part I was making needed another little snip to make the little piece for that wiring connector. So then I could just bend it into the shape that I needed in the vise. That's the little tab. I'll measure it then against the original, and that's close enough. It'll do the job. So I start cleaning up the bumper brackets themselves. They look pretty hungry, as I say, but they cleaned up quite well. That was a bolt that sheared when I was removing the bumper almost 4 years ago now. I drilled it out, and then using this cheap tap set, put some threads back into it. I also had this towing eye that mounts on and sticks out through the bumper, so I found that in one of my boxes and cleaned that up too. So after the wire wheel on the grinder, there's still a few little inaccessible bits, and I used the stub of a wire brush to get in at all those places, then blew off all the dust. And I used a little bit of rust stop to prevent them corroding again. Back to my boxes of supplies, and mounted on those little brackets that I had made for the fog light. I just assembled the whole thing and spray painted all together. Make sure it fits, and hopefully that'll line up well with the aperture in the bumper. So I mixed up some zinc primer That just needs a little bit of cellulose thinners, about 10% to thin it out, and I added that to my spray gun. Hung them up in the restoration booth I've built for the camper van. I then gave them a covering of matte black. So I left them to dry for about a day actually, and carried on with some other jobs. So this was the one with the trailing arms where the routing of the handbrake cable was wrong, and I thought I was going to have to turn the arms around, but actually I just realised I could just loosen off the screw and flip the little rubber support over, and that would keep the cable out of the way of the wheel. Sometimes it's good to take a step back from a job and not just launch into a pile of effort. That was a simple solution. Then other little things, I'd released all these clips that hold the brake pipes so I could get paint on the actual supports for the pipes. So I'd left most of them in position. This one actually I'd stored off the car, but I just clip these back on, and now all the pipes are held firmly again. So this was that breather pipe that lets the air out of the tank as the fuel goes down the filler neck. The original had a metal section in the middle that was completely corroded, so I actually just decided to replace it with a single pipe. I cut that to measure. And then I used a little bit of a larger pipe, which I cut to put a couple of little protective shields on it. This was a nice fit. And then I had the spring brackets to go on the ends. Needed a bit of lubricant to get it on easily. And that's a fuel grade hose, although it'll mostly be just handling vapor. Spring clip into position. It has the same on the other end. And I'll just use some heavy duty tie wraps to hold that to the filler pipe, which has protection on it in a couple of areas. So that's good now to think that the fuel system is all sealed off the way it should be. There was a couple more little bolts left underneath. That one holds the fuel pipe to and from the engine bay. Just tightening up all these little loose ends. That's a little bracket for the handbrake cable, which I'd now rerouted correctly on both sides. This was a little tricky to line up the bolt into the threads, so I got a nut and put it into the socket, and then that meant I could push it in nice and square and find the original threads. Although the filler neck was functioning fully now, there's a few little details to do around the flap. I'd had it fixed to the car for painting, but there were some other parts to go in. So I removed the flap. I located the cable release mechanism and then fitted in this cowling that stops any spills going down into the car, and this lovely little plate that would remind anyone filling the car that it's a diesel and not a petrol, making sure not to drop that down into the tank at this stage. Probably a good idea to get that cap back on now. There's 4 more bolts to go in around that area. So with that all bolted on, I'd have to reach in behind the panelwork on the interior. I left this loose since it had all come off, and I had to feed that release mechanism through the hole here and get the nut on that. I'd kept all these parts in a little plastic bag, and there was one I was looking at going, what is that? But when I stared at the whole mechanism, I realised it just clipped on here, and it's a spring to help that door pop out when you release the cable. I then fitted the lock mechanism. And it all seems to function. I'm delighted that I still have a key that does all the locks on this car. That's the cable mechanism. The rear seatbelt reel had to be released in order to get in behind that panel. So just tighten that back on. The clips had broken on these trim panels, but luckily I had ordered a little set of similar clips, so this is nice to use those now. There's a support to go on here now for the parcel shelf, and I left the screws in place for that. Really glad to be finding all these bits and pieces. I'd stored these in the boot during the entire project. And I could put on the covers that go behind the tail lights now. Not the largest boot, but the 60-40 split on the back seat was right up to date for the time. And I still have an intact parcel shelf with no speaker holes. It's great. Don't leave that socket in the boot. So return to work on the bumper. My brackets had dried by now. I just had some masking to remove from the wiring for these, and then to fish out this little rubber grommet that keeps the interior dry. That's that towing eye going into place. Looks quite ridiculous without the bumper in place, but actually it's quite neat when it's all in. Now to fit the metal bumper parts to the plastic, I decided to use all new nuts and bolts because so many of the original ones had sheared or had to be cut off. Now, as there was clips with retainers in here before, I had to come up with something clever that I'd be able to reach this without having a captive nut. So I actually put an extra nut down along the bolt, which meant it stuck out a little bit further on the inside that I can't reach from here. I put on a washer on the other side and then a washer here and a nylock nut. Same on this side. So this took my time and I was able to keep a finger on it at all stages so it wouldn't drop out. Got my nylock nut on, and then I had enough sticking out the back that I could get a spanner in and hold it. So it was double height on the inside there, which made it useful. And just tighten them up. Chewy decided he wanted to hold on to my spanner here, like he did my pliers for nearly 3 years. But I wasn't going to donate this. So I got my Jefferson spanner back. Same deal on the other side. And then there's a bar that links these up. These are nice and accessible. So not so much fuss putting these on. They came up well, these brackets, because they looked so bad when they first came off. Now I can put my fog light in from the outside and then bolted it on the inside. Taped back on those wiring brackets. And I was delighted that the hole was the right gauge for that to clip into. So I shouldn't have any bits of wiring hanging out where it shouldn't. Fit that up into place. I'll give that bumper a treatment when I clean up the car at the end of the project. The usual discoloration for bumpers of this era. It would have been an option to go body color with these during the project painting, but I just felt that that would betray the era that this car was made. So for better or worse, I've decided to leave them in the black or faded grey as they are at the minute. Nice quality connectors here. This is definitely a theme throughout the whole Daihatsu. A very, very impressively made car originally. Bolted on the brackets that go through these rear chassis legs. Had to drop the exhaust to get at these two. One of them wasn't original, that was the one I had to drill out, so I had a different size on the socket for that. Two other little ones keep the bumper in shape. A bolt in each wheel arch completes nearly all of the back end jobs.
Actually starting to look respectable now.